Hello, this is Domenico with Easynomics, and we're going to look at the short-run Phillips curve in the context of a current real-world example, looking at the United States, the impact of the rising inflation as a result of expansionary fiscal policy, and also cost-push inflation as a result of the Russian-Ukrainian war. I will put a link in the top right corner to this previous video. In this previous video, we looked at the monetarist model illustrating the creation of an inflationary gap going from point A to point B, demand pull inflation, 80 shifting outward. And in that video, we went over the details as to why, using the United States as the applied example, and saw the link between this model and the business cycle. The business cycle is measuring real GDP on the y-axis and time on the x-axis, and we see economies go into boom and busts, inflationary gaps, which we were illustrating here, and recessionary gaps. And if we collect the long-run average level of GDP growth over time, that creates our long-term growth trend, which is represented by the LRES curve. And the LRES curve also shows the average level of unemployment over decades. And in the United States, we could see that was about 5%. So in this video, we're going to use this same model. I'll keep this model here, but on the right side, I'm going to use the short-run Phillips curve. So this is what we have, okay? So again, if you want to see that previous video of creating this model, you can. I'll have the link in the top right corner. And in graph A, we're using the monetarist model. We're measuring price level, prices of goods and services on average in the economy on the y-axis, real GDP on the x-axis. We have our downward sloping aggregate demand curve, which is the sum of consumption spending, investment spending, government spending, and exports minus imports. And we have the upward sloping short-run aggregate supply curve, upward sloping because as costs of production, land, labor, capital, resources are held constant, we see that as the price level rises, the profit margin for firm increases, which incentivizes them to increase the quantity of their aggregate supply. And we have the perfectly inelastic long-run aggregate supply curve, which is illustrating the long-run average level of outputs that are being produced in the economy when we achieve full employment, when we're at the average level of unemployment within the economy. So we're 81 equals SRS1 equals LRS1 at point A. We have a price level at PL1 with real GDP at full potential. And in that previous video, I highlighted that the average level of unemployment in the United States is about 5%, and the target rate of inflation is 2%. So that would be our starting point. Here in graph B, we're illustrating the long-run Phillips curve, and the long-run Phillips curve is reflective of the long-run aggregate supply curve. It illustrates the full employment of resources and the average level of unemployment that we achieve in the economy that is relatively fixed unless we change some aspect of the structural economy. We know that the natural rate of unemployment is equal to structural unemployment, frictional unemployment, seasonal unemployment. If we're able to alter that, that could lead to a shift in LRES, also a shift in long-run Phillips curve. But essentially, the long-run Phillips curve is highlighting the average level of unemployment in the economy, which here we see is 5%, equivalent to the LRES at full potential, unemployment at 5%. And at point A, we see that the rate of inflation, which is being measured on the y-axis, is 2%. So there's a similarity here at point A with 5% unemployment, which is what we're measuring on the x-axis, and the rate of inflation at 2%. The same here in the monetarist model, point A, full potential with price level perhaps at about 2%. Let's look at some real-world data to illustrate that. Here we have United States unemployment rate over time. We can see that it fluctuates, right, with the business cycle. And if we're, taking, not taking into account too much economic crises like the 2008 crisis and the COVID pandemic, we would typically see it floating around here, all right, within this boundary. And the U.S. economy is gravitating back towards this boundary. And that boundary is between 4 and 6%. So if we looked at an even longer period of time, let's say 25 years, let's see if I can click on that. Oh, that is a 25-year period. Sorry. We can see that U.S. economy usually has about 5% unemployment on average over decades. Okay. So that's our starting point. And then we want to understand, why is aggregate demand shifting out? So we go into the pandemic, we go into lockdown, and the US central government engages in aspects of expansionary fiscal policy. They're increasing aspects of government spending, also providing transfer payments to households so that they can spend into the economy. And we can see that part of the CARES Act, the Coronavirus AIDS Relief and Economic Security Act, adults were receiving $1,200 from the central government. Families were receiving more if they had children. There was about $260 billion in increased unemployment benefits being spent, and so on. So an incredible amount of economic stimulus, fiscal policy here, equivalent to about $2.2 trillion of government spending and transfer payments being provided to households, leading to household spending. So here we understand that in graph A, in the monetarist model, if we're starting at point A and the US government is providing transfer payments to households, and households, as they exit the pandemic, increase their consumption spending rises. Part of these households that are taking some of their savings, since they were not able to spend during the pandemic, they're accumulating savings and they might be increasing their investment spending. There was a slight housing boom in the United States. In addition to the expansionary fiscal policy, we also have, let's see here, expansionary monetary policy. During the pandemic, we can see that the central bank of the US, the Federal Reserve, reduced interest rates. And lower interest rates incentivizes firms and households to borrow money cheaply and then spend into the economy. So we see that expansionary monetary policy as well. So consumption spending is rising due to expansionary fiscal policy, transfer payments to the household, investment spending is rising, lower interest rates, perhaps firms and households are borrowing and spending into the economy, and there's aspects of increased government spending. All of that causes the aggregate demand curve to shift out from 81 to 82. That sets an equilibrium at point B. Real GDP is increasing from YP to Y inflation, and we see the price level rising from PL1 to PL2. So this type of demand pull inflation, aggregate demand pulling inflation upwards, is causing inflation in the US economy to eventually rise from 2 to 4%. Because of that increased aggregate demand, we see firms increasing the quantity of their aggregate supply along their SRAS curve from point A to point B. So firms are employing more resources, land, labor, capital. And as a result, we would expect unemployment to fall from 5% to about 3.9%. So in the short-run Phillips curve, the short-run Phillips curve is illustrating that there is a trade-off or a negative relationship between the rate of inflation and the rate of unemployment, that they move in opposite direction. So here we can see, if we're getting more inflation due to demand pull inflation, that increased aggregate demand is incentivizing firms to employ more resources like labor, so we would expect unemployment to fall. So in the case, if inflation is rising, unemployment should be decreasing. So that would mean a movement along the short-run Phillips curve. This short-run Phillips curve is showing that negative relationship. Rate of inflation on the y-axis, rate of unemployment on the x-axis. So that would take us to a point here, point B, let's say. At point B, we see inflation rising to 2 to 4%. As we see here, PL rising from PL1 to PL2, 2 to 4%. And we also expect a fall in unemployment, since firms are rushing to employ more resources to meet the increased aggregate demand. So unemployment falls, let's say in the United States, to 3.9%. That low unemployment rate compared to the long run average would signal that we're entering an inflationary gap. Real GDP rising from YP to Y inflation. We're going to the boom of the business cycle. Okay, fine. Then what happens? We talked about in that previous model or that previous video that at point B, resources are becoming scarce. There's less and less unemployed land, labor, and capital resources. As firms compete against each other to acquire the last remaining land, labor, and capital resources, that causes cost of production to rise. How does firm A acquire a unit of labor versus firm B? Maybe they're going to incentivize that unit of labor to work for them by offering higher wages. And if they offer a higher wage to a new employee, they might have to offer wages to all of their employees. So wages would potentially be rising. Since wages are cost of production, the SRAS curve should be increasing from SRAS1 to SRAS2, equivalent to an inward shift in the SRAS curve. So here we have cost push inflation, cost of production increasing due to the scarcity of resources and firms competing against each other to acquire those resources, causing wages, rent, interest to rise. But in addition to that, we have some other problems hitting the global economy. Let's see here. In China, China's still pursuing a zero COVID policy, shutting down cities. That may disrupt the ability for firms in China and manufacturers in China to produce since labor is locked in. That can cause supply shocks in the global economy. We also have the Russian-Ukrainian war. We can see here that crude oil prices during the pandemic fell because there was reduced aggregate demand. People are locked at home. But right here, we see the spike in crude oil prices as a result of the Russian-Ukrainian war. Before, oil was perhaps trading about $65 a barrel, and then it almost goes up to $112, $120 a barrel approximately. All right, so it almost doubles in price, and that leads to rising gasoline prices worldwide. So fuel prices, energy prices are rising. Since everything is tied to gasoline for transportation to distribute inputs and outputs, a lot of goods and services also increase in price. Here we can see in the United States, energy prices are increasing to a large extent, as well as food prices increasing. Ukraine being a big exporter of cereal grain, along with Russia. Russia also a big exporter of fertilizer. So these are also causing supply shocks or rising costs of inputs such as food and energy. So again, we have the scarcity of resources causing wages, rent, interest to rise, and with the supply shock caused by the Russian-Ukrainian war, SRS also increasing, causing prices on average to rise from PL2 to PL3. So SRS1 shifts in or upwards. Now we're at this long-run equilibrium of point C. Due to the higher price, PL2 to PL3, we would expect that there'd be a reduction in the quantity of aggregate demand by households. And as households reduce the quantity of their aggregate demand from point B to point C, firms will begin to fire excess resources, leading to rising unemployment. Unemployment rising again, perhaps to 5% or more. So what would that look like in graph B, illustrating the long-run Phillips curve and the short-run Phillips curve? With the short-run Phillips curve, if there is a shift, here's a little note. If there is a shift in aggregate demand in the monetarist model, that would be a movement along the short-run Phillips curve. Okay, so we see that when AD shifts out from 81 to 82, we're moving along the short-run Phillips curve from point A to point B to illustrate that negative relationship. If inflation goes up, unemployment goes down. But what happens when the SRAS curve shifts? If there's a shift in the short-run, the short-run aggregate supply curve, if the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts, that's going to cause a shift in the short-run Phillips curve. And the two move in opposite directions. So if the SRAS curve is shifting inwards, the short run aggregate supply curve, if it's shifting inwards, then the short run Phillips curve is going to shift outwards. So here we have a shift in the short run Phillips curve. It's going to go from SRPC1 to SRPC2, something like this. Okay, approximately. Here we have short run Phillips curve 2. The reason for the shift is that the only way we can get the price level to rise or inflation to rise and unemployment to rise is the short run Phillips curve has to shift out in that direction. So we're going to get point C right here, where we see both a rise in inflation and in unemployment at the same time. So here, where the short run Phillips curve intersects with the long run Phillips curve, that would be point C. Here we see a rise in inflation going from 4 to 8%. And we also see a rise in unemployment from 3.9 to 5%. The economy gravitating back towards that long run equilibrium. Okay, so that is an explanation, and I will now analyze the two models as I would for a paper exam. As can be seen, we have two graphs. Graph A is illustrating an inflationary gap with the monetarist model, and graph B is illustrating the long-run Phillips curve and the short-run Phillips curve. In graph A, we're measuring the price level, prices of final goods and services on average in the national economy of the United States. And on the x-axis, we're measuring real GDP. In graph B, we're measuring the rate of inflation on the y-axis and the unemployment rate on the x-axis. We have a perfectly inelastic long-run aggregate supply curve in graph A, illustrative of the average level of employed resources to produce the amount of outputs that is produced when we fully employ those resources. And the United States long-run average level of unemployment is 5%. So when we're employing 5% of when we have 95% of our labor force employed, this is the most amount of goods and services that we can and should be producing. In graph B, the long-run Phillips curve is reflective of the LRES curve. It illustrates the long-run average level of unemployment in the U.S. economy, which is about 5%. In graph A, we have two downward sloping aggregate demand curves labeled 81 and 82, equal to the sum of consumption spending, investment spending, government spending, and exports minus imports. It's downward sloping due to the wealth effect, the interest rate effect, and the international trade effect. And we have an upward sloping SRES curve due to cost of production being held constant in the short run. And as the price level rises, the profit margin for firms increases, thus incentivizing them to increase the quantity of their aggregate supply. In graph B, we have a type of downward sloping short run Phillips curve that illustrates that there's a negative relationship between inflation and unemployment. In graph A, where 81 equals SRS1 equals LRS, at point A, it establishes an equilibrium price level at PL1 with inflation at approximately 2% and real GDP at YP with unemployment at the long run average of about 5%. We're at the natural rate of unemployment at 5%. Graph B illustrates that the intersection of the short run Phillips curve 1 with the long run Phillips curve at point A establishes a rate of inflation at 2% and a rate of unemployment at 5%. Due to the United States using expansionary fiscal policy with the CARES Act, providing transfer payments to households and increasing their investment in government spending, as well as expansionary monetary policy by the Federal Reserve lowering interest rates, we see households increasing their consumption spending as we exit the pandemic, spending those stimulus checks. Lower interest rates cause households and firms to borrow and spend into the economy, along with increased government spending. That causes aggregate demand to shift out from 81 to 82. That establishes a new equilibrium where 82 equals SRS1 at point B, establishing a new price level at PL2 and real GDP increasing from YP to Y inflation. In graph B, we see that as a result of a shift in the aggregate demand curve, there's a movement along the short-run Phillips curve from point A to point B, where we see the inflation rate increasing from 2 to 4% and the unemployment rate falling from 5 to 3.9%. In graph A, at point B, since resources are becoming increasingly scarce and firms are competing for those resources, to acquire those resources, firms might be offering higher wages, interest, and rent. In addition, we have the Russian-Ukrainian war causing supply shocks, causing rising energy prices, petroleum prices, natural gas prices, along with rising food prices due to Ukraine and Russia being large exporters of cereal grains and fertilizer. That all contributes to increased costs of production. That causes the SRAS curve to shift upward or inward from SRAS1 to SRAS2, establishing a new equilibrium at point C, where SRAS2 equals 82 with LRES. Again, causing more inflation, price level rising from PL2 to PL3. And because of the higher price level, we would expect households to reduce the quantity of their aggregate demand along their AD curve from point B to point C, causing firms to fire some of their excess resources, leading to rising unemployment. Since there is a shift in the short-run aggregate supply curve, there will be a shift in the short-run Phillips curve. The short-run Phillips curve shifts outward as a result of the short-run aggregate supply curve shifting inward. Where short-run Phillips curve 2 intersects the long-run Phillips curve at point C, we see a continued increase in inflation from 4 to 8%. And we also see an increase in unemployment from 3.9 to 5%. So in the short run, we see that there is a negative relationship between inflation and unemployment. But in the long run, we see with the long run Phillips curve, you can have inflation and unemployment going up at the same time. All right, so in the long run, with the long run Phillips curve, you can have inflation rising and unemployment also rising at the same time, which is what we call stagflation. Okay? If you have any questions, feel free to comment those questions below. And don't forget to subscribe and to like. Thank you so much.